On his 40th birthday, the most feared man in Chicago sat alone at a restaurant table and got thrown out like a drunk off the street. What happened next changed everything. For him, for a struggling single mother, and for a child who just wanted a birthday cake. This is the story of Damien Valente, a man who built an empire on blood and silence, and the one night that cracked him open. If this kind of story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because it only gets darker before it gets true. The reservation had been made 3 weeks in advance, not by Damien himself. He didn't make reservations, didn't call ahead, didn't do anything that required a name attached to a time slot. That was the kind of thing that left a paper trail, and paper trails had a way of ending careers. Or lives. He had people for those things. Marcus, his personal attaché, had booked the table under a corporate alias, something clean and forgettable, a shell entity that existed only on paper and paid its taxes on time. The kind of name that made maitre d's smile and reach for their best tablecloths. Damien had picked the restaurant himself, which was unusual. He'd driven past it twice over the last month, not because he was casing it, though old habits meant he clocked the exits anyway, the sight lines, the position of the bar relative to the front door, but because something about the place bothered him in a way he couldn't name. It was lit warmly. That was it. Through the front window on a cold November evening, it looked like the inside of something that still worked, something whole and unbroken, and he'd found himself slowing the car twice without meaning to. He wanted one dinner. That was all. One dinner without the weight of the Valente name sitting across from him at the table. He wore a dark wool coat, no tie, no cufflinks with the family crest, no security. Marcus had nearly had a stroke over that last part. Damien had listened to the argument, given it the 3 seconds it deserved, and told Marcus to spend the evening at home with his wife. Then he'd walked out of the Valente townhouse on North Astor Street and driven himself south toward River North, which he hadn't done in 11 years. The restaurant was called Fennel. It occupied the ground floor of a converted printing warehouse, the kind of space that cost a fortune to look effortless. Exposed brick, pendant lighting, a menu that used the word sourced 4 times in 6 lines. He didn't care about any of that. He cared about the corner table he'd seen through the glass, the one that faced the wall, the one where a man could sit with his back to something solid and eat a meal without anyone asking him for anything. The hostess was young, maybe 23, with a practiced smile that faltered only slightly when Damien walked in without a jacket check, without pausing, moving through the entry the way men move when they're accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around them. She checked her screen, found the corporate alias, and began walking him toward the dining room. That was when the manager appeared. He materialized from somewhere near the host stand, moving with the particular velocity of a man who had already decided something. He was mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, wearing a black suit that cost more than most people's car payments, and he carried himself with the specific arrogance of someone who had never once considered that the room might not be his. His name, Damien would later learn, was Preston Hale, general manager of Fennel for 6 years, the kind of man who lorded over a dining room the way small men lord over anything they're given, completely and without grace. "Sir?" Hale stepped in front of the hostess, cutting her off mid-stride. "I'm going to need to stop you right there." Damien stopped, not because he was told to, because something in the man's tone registered as a specific kind of interesting, the kind that required information before response. "There's a problem with your reservation," Hale said. He didn't phrase it as an apology. He didn't lower his voice. 2 couples at nearby tables had already glanced over. "The corporate card on file was flagged by our system. We're not in a position to honor the booking." "Run a different card," Damien said. His voice was flat. Not loud, not aggressive. Flat the way concrete is flat. "That's not really the issue." Hale clasped his hands in front of him. "We've had some concerns about the entity on the reservation. We've decided it's not a booking we're comfortable honoring this evening." The hostess had gone very still. Damien looked at Hale for a moment, the way you look at something you've stepped in. Then he said quietly, "Get me your owner." "The owner isn't available." "Then get me whoever owns the owner." Something moved across Hale's face. Not embarrassment, not quite. Satisfaction, more like. The satisfaction of a man who had a policy, and a policy gave him permission. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We are fully committed this evening, and I really can't tie up the entrance. The two couples had stopped pretending not to listen. A busboy near the far wall had gone motionless, a water pitcher in his hand, watching. Damien felt something move through him. Not anger. Anger was an emotion, and emotions had a way of making you sloppy. This was something older and quieter, a thing that lived below the ribs and had been living there for the better part of 2 decades. The thing that had kept him alive when 3 of his father's rivals had decided, in the spring of his 28th year, that the Valente bloodline needed to end. He'd gotten through that particular problem by being very, very still, and then very, very fast, and by making sure that no one who wanted to make an example of him lived long enough to finish the lesson. He didn't want to bring that thing into this restaurant. He genuinely didn't. He'd come here to eat a meal like a human being, which was a thing he did less often than anyone who knew him would believe. And he did not want Preston Hale to become a problem that required solving. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, closed slightly. Not into fists, just closed. I'm going to give you one opportunity, Damien said, and his voice had dropped another register, the way pressure drops before a storm, to walk back whatever you think you're doing here. Hale smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that knew it had an audience. Sir, I really must insist. Damien! The voice came from across the dining room, sharp and surprised and entirely without hesitation, and it hit the moment like a stone hitting still water. Damien turned. She was standing at a table near the center of the room, a woman he had never seen in his life, and she was looking at him with the focused, deliberate expression of someone making a decision at speed. She was maybe mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in the kind of ponytail that said she'd redone it twice today and it still hadn't cooperated, wearing a blouse that had been ironed, but not recently. There were shadows under her eyes. Not the romantic kind, the working kind. Beside her sat a small boy, maybe 7 years old, with a paper crown on his head that had already begun to list to one side. On the table between them sat a cupcake with a single candle, unlit. "Oh my gosh," the woman said, already moving toward him, already threading between tables with a naturalness that suggested she had done harder things than this on shorter notice. "I can't believe... I had no idea you were coming tonight." She reached him and put her hand on his arm, and he felt the slight pressure of her fingers and understood, with the crystalline clarity that 40 years of reading rooms had given him, exactly what she was doing. She was lying, deliberately, expertly, without breaking eye contact. He had no idea why. "I tried to call," she said, turning to include Hale in the conversation with the smooth competence of someone who had dealt with worse than Preston Hale on a Tuesday. "He's my husband's brother. Well, ex-husband's, but family's family, right? I made the reservation for 3. I completely forgot to update the name on the booking. That's my fault entirely." She looked at Hale with a smile that was warm, but had steel behind the warmth, the kind of smile that made it clear she wasn't asking for a favor. She was identifying an administrative error and waiting for it to be corrected. "Can we just get the 3rd setting added to our table? He can sit with us." Hale looked from her to Damien. His certainty flickered. Damien looked at the woman. She was watching him with steady dark eyes, and there was nothing in them that resembled fear or calculation. There was something else, something that looked improbably like exhaustion and resolve occupying the same space at the same time. "That'd be good," Damien said. He heard the word come out of his own mouth and felt something strange accompanying it, something like surprise at himself. "I should have called ahead." Hale's jaw worked once. He looked at the woman who had not stopped smiling. He looked at Damien, who had not stopped being precisely what he was, which was a man you didn't want to have made a mistake with. "I'll have a setting added," Hale said, and walked away. The woman turned immediately, already moving back toward her table, and Damien followed because there was nothing else to do, and because he found himself genuinely curious about what came next. They reached the table. The boy looked up at him with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only children and certain predators use. Damien hit the kitchen door shoulder first, and it swung hard into the wall, and the noise from the dining room came through behind them like a wave. More glass, more shouting, the flat crack of a third shot that hit something structural and sent a vibration through the floor tiles. The kitchen was bright and loud in a different way. Sheet metal surfaces, the roar of exhaust fans, a line cook frozen at the grill with a spatula in his hand, staring at the three people who'd just come through the door like the building was on fire. A sous chef near the pass had already dropped behind the prep counter. Smart. Back door, Damien said. Not to Hannah, not to anyone specific, just into the room. The line cook pointed without speaking, arm extended toward the far end of the kitchen, past the fryer station and the cold storage units, where a gray metal door sat beneath a red exit sign. Damien moved. Hannah was right behind him, Eli's face buried in her shoulder, the boy making no sound at all, which was either shock or a species of courage that 7-year-olds sometimes had access to and adults had mostly forgotten. They were 8 feet from the back door when it opened from the outside. Damien stopped. Hannah stopped behind him, her breath hitting the back of his neck. The man who came through was alone, moving fast, and he had the door half open before he registered Damien standing directly in front of him in the hard fluorescent light of the kitchen. His hand was already coming up. Damien closed the distance before the hand finished rising. It was not a clean or cinematic thing. It was fast and close and ugly, the way real violence always was, and it lasted approximately 4 seconds. And at the end of it, the man was on the kitchen floor and Damien was breathing through his nose with his jaw set and his right hand aching from the second impact. He looked down at the man, then crouched and took what was under the jacket, a 9mm standard, nothing custom, and stood back up. He turned. Hannah was looking at him. Eli had turned his head and was also looking at him over his mother's shoulder with the enormous, unblinking eyes of a child who has just recategorized something. There was nothing to say about it. Damien went past her back toward the line cook, who was still behind his station, back pressed against the wall. "Is there another way out?" Damien asked him. The cook nodded, barely. "Loading dock," he managed. "Left out the back, down the alley, roll-up door on the side of the building." "How many steps to get there from this door?" The cook blinked. "What? How many steps, roughly?" Maybe 30, 40? Damien nodded. He went back to the door, stepped over the man on the floor without looking at him, and opened it 2 inches. The alley was narrow, lit only by the ambient glow of the street at its far end. He scanned left and right. Nothing moving, nothing visible. That didn't mean nothing was there, but it was what he had. He looked back at Hannah. She was watching him with that same quality of attention she'd had at the table, the same eyes that didn't flinch and didn't perform anything. She was scared. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held Eli, but she was the kind of scared that organizes itself rather than the kind that comes apart. "Loading dock," he said. "Stay behind me and stay close. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to run, you run, and you don't look back and you don't wait for me." "And Eli?" "You hold on to him and you don't let go regardless of what you hear." She shifted Eli higher against her chest. "Okay," she said. "No questions, no negotiation." He filed that away somewhere and pushed the door the rest of the way open and went out into the cold. The alley smelled of garbage and the specific metallic cold of a Chicago November, the kind that got into your sinuses and stayed there. The noise from the front of the building had changed character. Less immediate, more dispersed, which meant either the shooters had moved or the police were close enough to have shifted the calculus. Neither was necessarily good. If the police arrived before Damien was clear of the scene, the evening's problems would multiply in directions he didn't have the bandwidth to manage right now. He moved left, keeping his back near the wall, the 9mm in his right hand. Behind him, he could hear Hannah's footsteps, the soft sound of Eli's breathing, the rustle of her coat. She was keeping pace. Good. The roll-up door was where the cook had said it would be, a corrugated metal panel set into the side wall of the building, padlocked from the outside. Damien looked at it for 1 second, then moved past it to the end of the alley, where it opened onto a side street running parallel to the main block. A car was parked at the curb with its engine running. Damien stopped. The car was a black sedan, no markings, and the engine was running, and the lights were off, and those two facts together meant something specific. He watched it for 3 seconds. The driver's silhouette was visible through the glass, not moving, looking straight ahead. Waiting. Damien made a decision. He moved to the passenger side of the nearest parked car, an anonymous gray four-door with a city parking permit in the window, and tried the handle. Locked. He looked at the car ahead of it, a 10-year-old Volvo wagon, the kind of car that said 2 kids and a mortgage. Handle. It opened. He turned back to Hannah. Get in, back seat. Keep Eli down. She came without hesitating, folding herself and Eli into the back seat, pulling the doors shut with a deliberateness that kept the sound down. Damien got in the front, found what he needed under the steering column, and had the engine running in 40 seconds. You're stealing this car, Hannah said from the back. I'll replace it. That's not really the... I know, he said. I'll replace it. He pulled out without lights, moving away from the side street, taking the first right that put distance between them and the restaurant, then another right that fed them onto a northbound street with enough traffic to absorb a moving vehicle without registering as notable. Only then did he turn the headlights on. Eli said from the back seat, in a very small voice, Mom. I've got you, Hannah said. I've got you, you're okay. Is that man going to be okay? The one on the floor? A pause. He's going to be okay, Hannah said, in the careful voice parents use when the answer is complicated and the child is 7. Damien drove. His heart rate was coming down with the practiced deceleration of long experience, settling back towards something functional, and his mind was doing what it always did in the aftermath of something like this, which was run backward through the sequence of events looking for the seam. The reservation had been clean. Marcus had used a shell entity that had been used exactly once before for a dinner in New York 14 months ago, and there was no connective tissue between that dinner and tonight's that anyone outside the immediate circle would have access to, which meant the leak was inside that circle. Small circle. 4 people who had known about tonight: Marcus, Damien's head of security Reeves, his consigliere Vincent Carr, and his underboss, a man named Carl Briggs, who had been with the Valente organization for 16 years and whose daughter Damien had paid a year of medical school tuition for. 16 years. Medical school tuition. He drove. After a while, Hannah said quietly, Where are we going? Somewhere safe, he said. I have a property on the north side. No one knows about it except me. Another pause. He could feel her working through something. Who were those men? She asked. He kept his eyes on the road. People who wanted me dead. Do they know about us? About me and Eli? He thought about that honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, and because she was also smart enough to know if he gave her something else. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm treating the situation as if they do. Eli had fallen asleep against Hannah's side, his paper crown still somehow attached to his head, tilted at a 45-degree angle now, and his breathing had gone slow and even in the way children's breathing does when adrenaline runs out and the body simply takes what it needs. Hannah looked down at him for a moment. Then she looked up and met Damien's eyes in the rearview mirror. Tell me the truth, she said. Are we in danger? It wasn't a question the way she said it. He held her eyes in the mirror. Yes, he said. She nodded once, looked back down at her son, adjusted the paper crown so it wasn't pressing against his ear. Outside the windows, Chicago moved past them in the dark. The lit storefronts and the orange sodium glow of the street lamps and the lake somewhere to the east, invisible but present the way it always was, cold and enormous and indifferent to whatever was happening to whoever was near it. Damien's phone had been buzzing in his coat pocket since they left the alley. He hadn't answered it. He knew who it would be. Marcus, Reeves, possibly both. The entire security apparatus of the Valente organization coming awake like a disturbed nest. Everyone moving, everyone talking, everyone except the one person who'd pointed the gun. That person, he thought, was probably also calling, checking to confirm the job was done. He reached the safe house 20 minutes later, a narrow row house in Andersonville that appeared on no Valente document, purchased through a series of transfers so clean and indirect that even his own attorneys couldn't have traced it without a map. He'd bought it 4 years ago for reasons he hadn't fully articulated to himself at the time. He understood them better now. He parked and came around and opened the back door. Eli stirred but didn't wake. Hannah got out with the boy in her arms, and Damien held the car door and then walked ahead to the row house door and unlocked it and went in first, clearing the entry the way he always cleared rooms, because that was not a habit that ever turned off. He turned on a lamp in the front room. It was a spare space, clean, almost monastic, a couch, a table, 2 chairs, a kitchen through a doorway. Nothing on the walls. A shelf with 3 books on it that he hadn't opened since he put them there. Hannah came in with Eli and looked around the room without commenting on it, which he appreciated, and found the couch and sat down and settled Eli across her lap, and the boy curled immediately, instinctively, without waking. She looked up at Damien. He was standing in the middle of the room, still in his coat, the weight of the evening settling into his bones in the way it always did afterward, the specific gravity of it. His right hand still ached from the kitchen. He was 40 years old. "Who are you?" Hannah said. Not accusation, not fear, just the question. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down in one of the chairs and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. And for the first time in 9 years in a position of absolute power, Damien Valente told someone the truth. He told her his name, his real name. And he watched her face change as the word Valente landed in the room between them, watched her put the pieces together with a speed that told him she wasn't sheltered from the world, wasn't the kind of woman who lived in ignorance of what certain names meant in this city and why. She sat with it. She looked down at her sleeping son. She looked back up. "Why would someone inside your own organization try to kill you?" she said. "And why did they choose tonight?" He'd been asking himself the same question since the first shot broke the mirror above the bar, and he was beginning to think he had the beginning of an answer, and the answer, if he was right, was worse than he'd expected. Because it wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a message. Carefully constructed, precisely delivered. Someone had wanted him dead in a specific way, in a specific place, on a specific night. And they had done something else too, something that was only now becoming clear as he sat in the cold quiet of the safe house and turned the evening over in his hands like evidence. They had put a woman and a child in the room with him, not by accident. Hannah was watching him, and her eyes were steady. And somewhere in the back of Damien Valente's mind, behind the cold machinery of calculation and consequence, something turned over slowly and would not stop. He had a problem. The problem was that he didn't yet know if Hannah Mercer had walked into that restaurant tonight by chance, or if someone had put her there. He didn't sleep. The safe house had a bedroom at the back, narrow, with a window that faced the alley and a lock on the door that he'd installed himself 3 years ago on a Sunday afternoon when he'd had nothing better to do than think about worst-case scenarios. He'd put Hannah and Eli in there around 1 in the morning, Eli still unconscious with the boneless depth of a sleeping child, Hannah carrying him in with the careful economy of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. She'd looked back at Damien once from the doorway. Nothing in the look that required a response. She closed the door. He sat at the kitchen table with the 9mm in front of him and his phone face down beside it, and he didn't touch either one for a long time. The apartment above made small sounds, pipes, settling wood, the distant moan of the elevated train 4 blocks east. Chicago at 2 in the morning had its own specific silence, the kind that wasn't actually quiet, but was at least honest about what it was. A city that didn't stop, just changed register. He turned his phone over. 19 missed calls, 11 from Marcus, 4 from Reeves, 3 from a number he didn't recognize, which was interesting, and 1 from Vincent Carr, his consigliere, which was the one that held his attention longest before he put the phone face down again. 1 call from Vincent, not 11, like Marcus, not 4, like Reeves. 1. A man who learned his boss had been shot at in a restaurant and called once and didn't follow up was either very calm or very confident about the outcome. Damien picked up the phone and called Marcus. It connected before the first ring finished. Jesus. Marcus's voice was wrecked, the way voices got when they'd been running hot for hours. Jesus, Damien, I'm fine, Damien said. Quiet, flat. Where are you? Reeves has 2 teams out. I'm not telling you where I am. Silence. The specific kind. Damien, I'm not telling you where I am, he said again with the same inflection, which was no inflection at all. Not yet. I need you to listen to me. Okay. Marcus's breathing was audible. Okay, I'm listening. The reservation, the shell entity. Who else knew about it besides you? Nobody. I booked it myself. I didn't. A pause. Reeves knew I was making a reservation. I had to tell him because of the security protocol. He wanted to send someone. I told him no security. I know. He pushed back. I told him your call was final. But he knew the restaurant. Damien filed that. What about the alias, the corporate entity on the booking? I used Lakeward Consulting. It's clean. I haven't used it since New York. Who knew about New York? Another pause. Longer. Vincent was at that dinner, Marcus said carefully. In New York. Damien said nothing. Damien, I'm not doing anything right now except getting information, Damien said. Don't call Reeves. Don't tell anyone you spoke to me. I'll be in contact in the morning. There were 2 men dead at the restaurant, Marcus said, fast, before Damien could end the call. Police have the scene. 1 in the dining room, 1 in the kitchen. The one in the kitchen, they're saying he went down before any of the responding officers got there. They want to talk to you. They can want that. Damien, CPD isn't the problem right now. The problem is that whoever did this is going to find out it didn't work. And then they're going to... I know what they're going to do, Damien said. Good night, Marcus. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the wall. Vincent Carr had been his father's man first. 23 years inside the Valente organization, longer than Damien had been running it. He had a house in Oak Park with a garden his wife maintained and a grandson he coached in Little League on Saturday mornings, and he had been the one who'd sat across from Damien 9 years ago and said, quietly, that the organization needed someone who could think 3 moves ahead of every problem, and that Damien was that person, and that he would follow him. Damien had believed him. He thought about Carl Briggs now, too. His underboss. 16 years, medical school tuition. Briggs, who was methodical and humorless and deeply loyal to the machinery of the organization, if not always to the men inside it. The problem with betrayal was that it looked exactly like loyalty until the moment it didn't. He made one more call. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and he listened to the outgoing message, which was brief and professional, and he did not leave a message of his own. Carl Briggs wasn't answering his phone at 2:15 in the morning. That was also interesting. He put the phone down and picked up the 9mm and checked it again, which he'd already done twice, which meant he was doing it for the feel of something concrete in his hands, rather than for any informational purpose. He set it back down. The bedroom door opened. Hannah came out in the dark, moving quietly, and she'd taken her hair down and it fell to her shoulders, and she looked different without the ponytail. Not softer exactly, but more like herself, whatever that meant. She was still in her clothes from the restaurant. She stopped when she saw he was still at the table. You haven't slept, she said. No. She went to the kitchen and found a glass and filled it with water from the tap and drank half of it standing at the sink. Then she turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. Eli's asleep, she said. He woke up about an hour ago and asked if we were camping. I told him yes. A pause. He seemed satisfied with that. Smart kid. He is. Something moved across her face. He's also going to have questions in the morning that are harder to answer than that one. Damien looked at the table. I know. I'm sorry. Are you? He looked up. I mean that genuinely, she said. Not as an attack. I'm trying to figure out who I'm dealing with here, and I've had about 3 hours in a locked room to do it, so I'm working with incomplete information. She set the glass on the counter. You told me your name. I know what that name means in this city, and I know that what happened tonight wasn't random. No, he said. It wasn't. Someone inside your organization tried to kill you. That's what the evidence suggests. And Eli and I were in the room. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Her arms were crossed, not defensively, just contained. The posture of someone who was cold or thinking hard or both. Were we targeted, she asked, or were we just there? He'd been sitting with that question for 3 hours. He gave her the honest answer, which was the only one he had. I don't know yet. The attack was planned specifically around my presence at that restaurant tonight. The level of planning required that someone knew about the reservation in advance, which means someone inside my operation sold the information. He paused. The choice to execute the hit in a crowded restaurant rather than somewhere isolated suggests either carelessness or intention. I haven't determined which. What's the difference? Carelessness means you were incidental. Intention means someone wanted witnesses, or wanted collateral damage, or... He stopped. Or what? He looked at her directly. Or wanted to put specific people in the room with me, to complicate the picture afterward. She held his gaze. You're asking if I was planted. I'm telling you it's a variable I have to account for. The kitchen was very quiet. The elevated train sound came and went in the distance, fading. I took Eli to that restaurant because it was his birthday, and he'd seen a commercial for it 8 months ago and hadn't stopped talking about it, Hannah said, with a flatness that was its own kind of emphasis. I made the reservation 6 weeks ago because the wait list was long and I wanted to make sure I got it. I have the confirmation email on my phone if you'd like to see the timestamp. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, That won't be necessary. Good, she said, because I have about enough goodwill left to get through breakfast, and I'd rather not spend any of it proving I'm not a spy. Something moved in his chest, not quite what he'd call amusement, but adjacent to it, and unfamiliar enough that he wasn't sure what to do with it. Get some sleep, he said. I'm not sure I can. Try anyway. I need you functional in the morning. She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that assessed him without flinching, that took him as data rather than as threat or authority. You need me functional, she repeated. You and your son are going to need to move in the morning. I need to arrange that. I need you rested enough to make clear decisions about where you go and who you contact. Who I contact, she said slowly. You mean you want me to not call anyone? I want you to understand that if you call someone tonight, and that someone is connected to anyone who might be connected to the people who came into that restaurant, you put yourself and Eli at risk. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm giving you the information. She stood with that for a moment. He could see her working through it, the specific way she processed things. Not quick exactly, but thorough, like she was checking her own reasoning for holes before she committed to it. My mother, she said. She watches Eli on school days. She's going to wake up tomorrow and he won't be at her door. I can have someone contact her. Someone clean. Someone who just tells her Eli is safe without giving location. She'll want to hear his voice. That can happen tomorrow, not tonight. Hannah looked at him. You have a lot of rules. The rules are why I'm still alive. She picked her water glass back up and finished it. She put it in the sink. She looked out the window above the sink at the alley, which was dark and empty and rain-wet. The man in the kitchen, she said without turning around. The one you put on the floor. He waited. Was that the first time you've done something like that? No. She nodded, once, at the window. I know, she said. I could tell. She pushed off the counter. I'm going back in with Eli. Wake me when it gets light. She went back into the bedroom, and the door closed, and Damien sat in the kitchen and listened to the building settle around him, and thought about Carl Briggs, who still hadn't called back. He was still thinking about it at 6 a.m. when his phone rang and the number was Briggs's, and he answered it. I heard, Briggs said, without preamble. His voice was steady, the voice of a man reporting a weather event. You're alive. Disappointed? A pause. Short. That's not funny. Wasn't meant to be. Where were you last night, Carl? Home, asleep. My phone was off. Your phone was off. I turn it off when I sleep, Damien. I'm 54 years old. I'm not on call 24 hours on the night someone tries to kill me. The silence this time was different, longer, and with more inside it. I didn't know about last night, Briggs said. If I'd known, I would have. What? Damien said. What would you have done? I would have warned you. Right. Damien looked at the wall. Outside, the sky was beginning to go gray at the edges, the particular gray of a November Chicago morning that didn't so much arrive as accumulate. I want a meeting, this morning. The warehouse on Pershing, 9 o'clock, you, me, Vincent, Reeves, nobody else. I'll be there, Briggs said. I know you will, Damien said, and ended the call. He went to the bedroom door and knocked twice, softly. A pause, then Hannah's voice, already awake, said, "Yeah." He opened the door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, Eli still curled and sleeping behind her, and she had her shoes on, which meant she'd either slept in them or put them on at the first sound of movement. He decided not to ask which. "I have a meeting in 2 hours," he said. "I'm going to leave someone here with you, someone I trust." "How large is your list of people you trust right now?" "Smaller than it was yesterday," he said. "But she's on it." Hannah's eyebrows moved. "She." "Her name is Donna. She's been with my family since before I took over. She will keep you and Eli safe until I'm back." "And if you don't come back?" He looked at her. "Then Donna has instructions." She absorbed this with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she'd brought to everything since the shots broke the mirror in the restaurant. Then she looked at her son, the slow breathing, the paper crown that had finally come detached sometime in the night and lay on the pillow beside him like a shed skin. "He's going to wake up soon," she said, "and he's going to want to know where we are and what happened and why we didn't go home." She picked up the crown and turned it in her hands. "What do I tell him?" Damien thought about what a 7-year-old could hold. "Tell him we're helping a friend move some things," he said. "Tell him we'll be home tonight." "Will we?" He didn't answer that, and she didn't push, which meant she already knew. Donna arrived at 7:30 in an unremarkable sedan and let herself in with the spare key Damien had directed her to, and she was 61 years old and built like a woman who had spent 40 years refusing to be impressed by anything. And she walked in, looked at Hannah, looked at the bedroom where Eli was beginning to make the pre-waking sounds of a child surfacing from sleep, and said, "I'll make eggs," and went to the kitchen. Hannah watched her go. She looked at Damien. He was pulling his coat on, checking the 9mm with the ease of long practice, resettling it, doing up 2 buttons. He was a different person in the morning light than he'd been at the restaurant, or maybe he was the same person and the restaurant had been the anomaly, the 40 minutes of dinner where he'd been something other than what he actually was. "Be careful," Hannah said. He paused. The words landed differently than he expected them to, and he didn't have an immediate response, which was unusual. "I'll be back by noon," he said. The warehouse on Pershing was a legitimate property, storage and light logistics, the kind of operation that paid its insurance premiums and filed its permits and attracted no particular interest from anyone. It was also the place where 9 years ago, Damien had held the meeting that consolidated his position after his father's stroke. The meeting where he'd looked at 7 men around a table and told them, quietly, that the organization would continue and he would run it, and any person in the room who had a different opinion should voice it now. Nobody had voiced it. He arrived at 8:45 and walked the perimeter first, which was habit, and found nothing wrong, which didn't mean nothing was wrong. Reeves was inside already, standing near the east wall with his arms crossed, and the specific tight expression of a head of security who had spent the last 12 hours constructing an elaborate account of how last night had not been his failure, even though it had been, at least in part, his failure. Damien looked at him, and Reeves met his eyes, and something passed between them that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't accusation, just acknowledgement. 12 hours, Damien said. "What do you have?" The two in the restaurant were freelance. Eastern European, both with records in 3 countries, both linked to a broker out of Detroit named Soren Mach, who runs contract work for, Reeves paused, for Castellano interests. Damien went still. "The Castellanos," he said. "The connection is indirect. Mach has run work for them before. It doesn't prove—" "No," Damien said. "It doesn't prove anything." He looked at the floor for a moment. The Castellano family operated out of Detroit with interests that had been bumping against Valente territory for 3 years. Low-level friction, the kind of thing that simmered without quite boiling. There had been a conversation 6 months ago about a distribution corridor that both families wanted. The conversation had been inconclusive. It also doesn't rule anything out. Vincent Carr arrived at 8:58, which was Vincent's way. Never early, never late, always arriving at the exact minute that said he was punctual without being eager. He was 64, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's mortgages, And he moved through the warehouse with the comfort of a man who had been in rooms like this his entire adult life. He looked at Damien and said, "Thank God." And it sounded like something real. Damien watched him say it. Carl Briggs arrived at 9:04, which was already a deviation from pattern, because Briggs was compulsively punctual, and Damien noted it without expression and said nothing. They stood in a loose configuration near the center of the warehouse floor, the four of them, and Damien looked at each of them in turn for long enough to be uncomfortable, and nobody said anything until he was ready. "The hit was sourced through Soren Mach," he said. "Detroit broker with Castellano connections. The reservation was booked under Lakeward Consulting, which has been used once before. New York, 14 months ago." He looked at Vincent. "You were at that dinner." Vincent nodded. "I was." "Who else knew about Lakeward?" "I don't recall discussing it," Vincent said, with the careful precision of a man who understood that precision mattered. "But I won't tell you it's impossible that I mentioned it to someone." "Who?" Damien said. "I'd have to think." "Think now." The warehouse was cold. One of the high windows was cracked and let in a thread of November air, and the distant sound of a truck on Pershing. Reeves was watching Vincent. Briggs was looking at a point on the floor 6 feet in front of him with the studied blankness of a man managing his own expression. Damien turned to Briggs. "Carl," he said. "Your ex-wife." Briggs looked up. The blankness cracked just slightly. "What?" "Sandra Briggs. She remarried 4 years ago. Husband's name is Tom Ricci." He watched Briggs's face. "Tom Ricci runs a trucking operation out of Cicero. He has a contract with a freight company that also holds contracts with 2 Castellano-adjacent distributors in the greater Detroit area." He paused. "Sandra and Tom Ricci attended the Castellano eldest son's wedding in April. You told me you didn't know about that." "I didn't," Briggs said. His voice had changed. Something had left it. "Sandra and I don't talk. You know that." "I know what you told me," Damien said. "Damien." Briggs took half a step forward and then stopped because of some instinct or some read of the room, and that half step and that stop were more information than anything he'd said. "I have given 16 years to this organization. I know what you've given," Damien said. "I also know that Hannah Mercer's ex-husband owes money." The room went very quiet. Briggs's face did something complicated. "What did you just say?" Reeves said. Damien kept his eyes on Briggs. "Hannah Mercer, the woman who was in the restaurant last night. Her ex-husband is a man named Derek Mercer. Derek Mercer has a gambling problem and a debt that has been passed through 3 collection points in the last 8 months, and currently sits with a collector who operates under Valente authority." He let that land. "Under your authority, Carl. In your sector." The silence stretched. "Someone knew she would be at that restaurant last night," Damien said. "Someone knew about the reservation, mine and hers. Someone put the 2 of us in proximity on purpose." His voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. "The question is whether Hannah Mercer was put in that room as a pawn, as a distraction, or as something else entirely. And the answer to that question depends on who knew about Derek Mercer's debt and who made a decision to use it." Briggs said nothing. "Carl," Vincent said quietly. "I want a lawyer," Briggs said. The words hit the room like something physical. Reeves straightened. Vincent went very still. Damien looked at Carl Briggs, a man he had trusted for 9 years, a man whose daughter's tuition he had paid, and he felt nothing that resembled surprise. What he felt was something older and colder and infinitely more dangerous, the thing that lived below the ribs and had been living there since he was 20 years old and first understood that the people closest to you were the only ones positioned to do real damage. "Get him out of here," Damien said to Reeves. "Keep him contained. No phone, no contact." Reeves moved. Briggs didn't resist, which was its own statement. The resistance of a man who had already calculated his position and decided cooperation was the better arithmetic. They were at the door when Briggs stopped and looked back. "The woman," Briggs said. "Hannah. What happens to her?" Damien looked at him. "She's nobody's problem," Briggs said. "She was never supposed to be part of this. The debt—" He stopped. Something shifted in his face, the specific collapse of a man whose story is becoming real to him as he tells it. The debt was just leverage, to get her into the room. She was never supposed to get hurt. Leverage, Damien said. The plan was for you to be isolated, for the hit to look clean. She was going to be a witness. Someone to find you, someone who could be... He stopped again. Managed, Damien said softly. Briggs said nothing. Her ex-husband's debt, Damien said. What's the number? Briggs told him. It wasn't a large number. In the context of what Briggs had just done, in the context of 16 years and a daughter's medical school tuition and a position of absolute trust, it was an almost insultingly small number. The price at which Carl Briggs had decided that Damien Valente's life was a reasonable transaction. Reeves took Briggs out. The door closed. Vincent Carr stood in the warehouse and looked at Damien with the expression of a man who was assembling a new picture from familiar pieces and not entirely happy with what it showed. The Castellano connection, Vincent said. Someone approached Briggs. That's the shape of it. That's the shape of it, Damien agreed, which means this wasn't just internal. Someone outside the organization decided to run an asset inside it. Vincent paused. That's a different problem than a traitor. I know what it is, Damien said. He was already thinking about Hannah Mercer's ex-husband and a debt that had been used as a key, and about the fact that she was in his safe house right now with Donna making eggs, and about Eli with his paper crown, and about the specific quality of stillness on Briggs's face when the word leverage had been said back to him. She was never supposed to be part of this, but she was. She was completely, irrevocably part of this now. And the man who had put her there was sitting in a car with Reeves, and the men who had told that man what to do were somewhere in Detroit, and Damien Valente had a decision to make that was going to determine everything that came after. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. Not the same unknown number from last night. A different one. He answered it. There was a pause on the line, then a voice he didn't know, calm and unhurried, with the particular flat effect of someone who communicated through layers of distance as a matter of professional practice, said, Mr. Valente, I understand last night was disappointing for everyone involved. I'd like to propose a conversation. Damien said nothing. The woman and the child, the voice continued, they're at a property in Andersonville. We've known the address since approximately 4 this morning. Another pause, and the pause was the message. More than the words. I think you and I have things to discuss before this goes any further. The call ended. Damien was already moving toward the door, his phone in his hand, running the distance between Pershing and Andersonville in his head, knowing it was 22 minutes on a good day, knowing this was not a good day, knowing with the cold, absolute certainty of a man who had been in this business long enough to understand what a threat dressed as a conversation actually meant. That whoever had just called him was not proposing a negotiation. They were telling him they could end this differently than he'd planned, and that Hannah Mercer and her 7-year-old son were the terms. He drove like the city owed him something. 22 minutes to Andersonville on a good day. He made it in 14, running 2 lights on the yellow and one that was not yellow at all. The sedan's engine climbing through registers that the car's previous owner had probably never asked of it. His right hand was on the wheel, and his left had the phone, and he was calling Donna before he'd cleared the first intersection, listening to it ring, counting the rings the way you count them when each one is its own small catastrophe. She picked up on the 4th. Talk to me, he said. We're fine. Her voice was level. Donna's voice was always level, which was one of the reasons he trusted her, and also one of the reasons she'd occasionally unnerved him over the years. Boys eating, woman's drinking coffee. What's wrong? Someone knows the address. Leave now. Take the Volvo. It's still at the curb. Drive to the secondary on Ravenswood, the one above the dry cleaner. You have the key. How long do we have? I don't know. Move like you have 5 minutes. He heard her put the phone down without ending the call, heard the muffled authority of her voice saying something to Hannah, heard the immediate scrape of a chair. No questions from Hannah, just movement. He kept the phone on the passenger seat and drove. The secondary on Ravenswood was a studio apartment above a dry cleaner that had been operating since 1987 and would continue operating until its owner died, which Damien hoped would not be soon because the dry cleaner served as one of 3 legitimate anchor points for properties he held under names that did not appear in any Valente document. He'd used it once before, 4 years ago, for a situation that had resolved without needing this level of escalation. That had been a simpler situation. He pulled onto Ravenswood 8 minutes after the call. The Volvo was already there, nosed into a spot half a block down, and that specific tightness in his chest loosened 1 degree. He went up the stairs and knocked twice. Pause. Once. Donna opened the door. She had Eli by the hand, and the boy was holding a half-eaten piece of toast and looking at Damien with the particular expression he'd been deploying since the kitchen of Fennel, that enormous, unblinking recalibration of the world. And Hannah was behind them both with her coat already on and her jaw set and her eyes doing the thing they did, the fast, systematic scan of a room followed by the slower, more considered assessment of the person in front of her. "We left the eggs," Eli said. "I'll get you more eggs," Damien said. They were almost done. "Eli," Hannah said quietly, and the boy subsided. Damien came in and closed the door and turned the bolt and put his back against the wall beside the window and looked out at the street. Nothing. A woman walking a dog. A city bus pulling away from the stop at the corner. Nothing that looked like anything, which meant nothing, and also potentially everything. He turned back to the room. Donna was already at the small kitchen counter, reassembling what calm she could from the available materials. Hannah was watching Damien. "Tell me," she said. He looked at Eli. Hannah looked at her son. "Eli, will you help Donna find the cups? There should be cups in that cabinet." Eli looked at the cabinet. The logic of the task engaged something in him, and he moved toward Donna, who had the specific gift of making small people feel useful, and within 30 seconds they were having a low conversation about whether the cups were above or below the plates. Hannah moved to Damien's side of the room. She kept her voice low. "Someone knows where we were," he said. Not a question, because she'd already understood that from the evacuation. "How?" "I don't know yet. The address was clean. The property isn't connected to anything traceable." He paused. "Which means either the leak is deeper than I thought, or someone followed Donna when she came in this morning, or someone had the block under surveillance before I even brought you there." "Prepositioned," she said. "Possibly." She absorbed this. Her hands were at her sides, not clenched, just present, and he noticed she was wearing the same clothes from last night, and that there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there at the restaurant table, and that she was still, despite all of it, not falling apart. He didn't know what to do with that exactly. It was easier, in his experience, when people fell apart. It gave you something to manage. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Your ex-husband, Derek Mercer." Something changed in her face. Not surprise, more like the recognition of a thing you'd been half expecting and had hoped wouldn't arrive. "What about him?" she said. "He owes money. A significant debt, run through collection points that sit under my organization's authority." He watched her face. "Someone used that debt as a mechanism. To find you, to know your routines, your plans, where you'd be on a specific evening." The silence was absolute for a moment. "To put me in that restaurant," she said. "Yes." She looked at the wall. Her jaw worked once. "Derek's been in trouble for years. I knew about the gambling. I didn't know about—" She stopped. "How much?" He told her the number, the same one Briggs had given him. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then opened them. "He used Eli's birthday dinner," she said. Not a question either, just the statement arriving with its full weight. "It appears that way." She turned her head and looked at her son, who was now explaining to Donna with great seriousness the correct method for stacking cups, and her face did something that Damien couldn't watch for more than a moment. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something more specific. The expression of a woman who had already done the brutal work of lowering her expectations of a person and was now discovering that the floor she'd landed on had another floor below it. "Where's Derek now?" she said. "I'm trying to find out." She nodded, pulled herself back into the room visibly, like a person pulling a coat closed against wind. "What happens next?" Before he could answer, his phone rang. The unknown number again, same one as before. He looked at it and then stepped to the corner of the room and answered. "You moved them," the voice said. Same flat effect. Unhurried. "That's fine. We're not interested in the woman and the child, Mr. Valente. I want you to understand that. They're inconvenient, not useful." "Then let's stop involving them," Damien said. "That's exactly what I'm proposing." A pause. "There's a location." I'll send it to this number. Come alone. Come in the next 2 hours. We'll have a conversation that resolves several outstanding issues, and the woman goes home to her bakery and the boy goes back to school, and none of this touches them again. And if I don't come, then we resolve it differently, and it takes longer, and it's less clean, and more people are in the margins. Another pause. I have no interest in collateral damage, Mr. Valente. I'm a business person. I want to talk about territory, and I want to talk about the corridor arrangement that your organization and mine have failed to settle for 3 years. Last night was a failure of communication, a correctable failure. Damien said nothing for a moment. He was listening to the voice, and behind the voice, he was listening to the room it came from. The faint ambient sound, the slight echo that suggested a large space, possibly with high ceilings. Industrial or warehouse, close to the water maybe. There was something in the background that could be wind off the lake, or could be HVAC. Who am I talking to? He said. Someone with the authority to make agreements that stick. A beat. The location will arrive in the next few minutes. I hope to see you. The call ended. The text arrived 40 seconds later. An address in the Bridgeport neighborhood, near the river. Damien looked at it. He looked at Hannah, who had watched the entire call with the focused stillness of someone who understood that what was happening on the other end of that phone determined the shape of the next several hours of her life. I have to go somewhere, he said. I know, she said. Donna stays with you. You don't leave this building until you hear from me directly, not from a number you don't recognize. My voice. She held his eyes. You're walking into something. Probably. Then why go? He slid the phone into his coat pocket. Because the alternative is staying here and waiting for it to come to me, and I don't wait well. He picked up his keys. And because someone used your son's birthday to try to put a bullet in me, and I have some things I want to say to the person who made that decision. Something crossed her face at that. Not quite gratitude. Something more complicated than gratitude, with more edges to it. Damien, she said. He stopped. She looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and then she said very simply, Come back. He left. The address in Bridgeport was a converted cold storage facility 2 blocks from the river, the kind of building that had been repurposed for light manufacturing and then repurposed again for something that required no visible signage and no listed tenants. He drove past it once, clocked the adjacent street, the loading area on the south side, the single visible camera above the main entrance that was positioned to capture approach from the west. He parked on the opposite side, approached from the east, and went in through a side door that had been left, with pointed courtesy, unlocked. Inside was exactly what the ambient sound on the call had suggested. A vast, high-ceilinged space with concrete floors and exposed steel beams, and the particular cold of a building that had once been kept at freezing temperatures for so long that the cold had become structural. There were lights rigged on portable stands near the center of the room, the kind of temporary lighting that said the people who'd set this up had done it recently and hadn't planned to be here long. There were 4 men standing in the lit area. 3 of them Damien had never seen. The 4th was someone he had seen, but not for 2 years, not since a dinner in a private room at a restaurant in Detroit where the food had been excellent and the conversation had been careful and nothing had been agreed upon. Marco Castellano, 46 years old, the eldest son, who now ran the family's operations in everything but formal title, because his father was 81 and the title was ceremonial and everyone knew it. He was a thin man with a controlled athletic build and the groomed precision of someone who considered his appearance a professional tool, and he was standing with his hands in his coat pockets looking at Damien with the specific expression of someone who had planned for most contingencies and was comfortable with the ones he hadn't. Mr. Valente, he said, thank you for coming. I almost didn't. I know, but here you are. He gestured loosely at the space around them. I apologize for the setting. I'm not in Chicago often, and I prefer not to use locations with histories. You prefer not to use restaurants either, apparently. Marco Castellano's expression registered this without changing in any meaningful way. Last night was not my preferred method. There were people inside your organization who were eager to accelerate a resolution, and I allowed their plan more latitude than I should have. That's on me. He paused. It was a mistake. Damien looked at him. The three other men were positioned at intervals, not aggressively, but positioned nonetheless, and he'd already calculated all three of them in the first 4 seconds and filed the calculations away. "Carl Briggs," he said. "We had a relationship with Mr. Briggs that predated my involvement," Marco said. "He approached us approximately 8 months ago with a proposal. He wanted a specific outcome, and we had complementary interests. He wanted my position." Marco tilted his head slightly, which was a confirmation without being one. "He represented certain concerns within your organization about its direction, about territorial decisions, about the corridor arrangement specifically. He indicated there was appetite for leadership that would be more amenable to a joint framework. And you decided to invest in that appetite. We decided to explore it. Last night's method was Briggs's design, not mine. My preference was always a conversation." He looked at Damien with something that might have been the closest Marco Castellano came to candor. "I don't want a war with the Valente organization. Wars are expensive, and they attract attention that benefits no one. I want the corridor. I want a formal framework for the distribution network between Detroit and Chicago. I want to sit down and draw a line and have both sides of the line be profitable." Damien had been listening to this and simultaneously thinking about it from several angles simultaneously, the way he'd trained himself to do in rooms like this, where the conversation happening on the surface was always accompanied by the one happening below it. He said, "And Briggs was going to deliver that. Briggs was going to deliver us a version of the Valente organization that was receptive. Yes. Instead, he delivered a dead attempt and a live witness." Marco's expression shifted fractionally. "The woman, Hannah Mercer, who was chosen specifically because her ex-husband's debt created a mechanism for placing her in that room." Damien watched Marco's face. "Did you know about that detail? The debt mechanism?" Marco was quiet for a moment. "I knew a civilian would be present. I didn't know the specifics of how her presence was arranged. But you knew a civilian would be used." The silence stretched. "We need to talk about the corridor," Marco said. "We'll get to the corridor," Damien said. "Answer the question." Another silence. Marco Castellano looked at Damien with the careful expression of a man deciding how honest to be, and apparently decided that a certain amount of honesty was the more strategic position. "I knew a civilian would be positioned as a witness. The function was practical, a credible, uninvolved witness to what was supposed to be a clean scene. Briggs's people were supposed to be gone before any witness saw anything relevant." He paused. "The execution was poor. The execution was poor. A woman and a 7-year-old in a restaurant full of gunfire, and the word for it was poor execution." Damien stood in the cold building and felt the thing below his ribs doing something he hadn't allowed it to do in a long time, which was stop being cold. He felt it get warm and then hot, and then he put a lid on it with the specific effort of a man who understood that heat made you fast but also made you stupid, and he needed to be neither fast nor stupid for the next several minutes. "Here's what I want," Damien said. His voice had not changed. This was the thing about him that had always unnerved the people who worked for him, that the temperature of his voice and the temperature of what was happening inside him were entirely independent variables. "I want the names of every person inside my organization that you had contact with, not just Briggs. Everyone." Marco looked at him. "I want Derek Mercer's debt cleared. Today." The paper shredded, the collectors pulled back, the entire instrument dissolved. He paused. "I want a written account of how Hannah Mercer's presence in that restaurant was arranged, who gave the instruction, who executed it, what was used. I want that in my hands by tonight. And in exchange," Marco said carefully, "in exchange I sit down with you in the next 72 hours and we talk about the corridor. Seriously. With the intention of reaching an agreement." He held Marco's eyes. "I've been slow walking that conversation for 3 years because I didn't see the benefit of formalizing an arrangement that benefited your family more than mine. I still don't see it that way, but I'm willing to look at it again." A pause. "With someone I can trust." "And Briggs." "Briggs is mine," Damien said. Marco looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the slight formal precision of a man who had been making this kind of agreement all his adult life and knew exactly what it cost and what it bought. They shook hands. It was a cold handshake, the kind that was less a gesture of goodwill than a gesture of mutual recognition. Two men who understood the same language acknowledging that they'd just spoken it. Damien was at the side door when one of the three position men said something low and quick, in a language he recognized but didn't speak, and Marco answered it, and the answer was short and sharp, and the man went quiet. Damien stopped. He turned. "What did he say?" Damien asked. Marco's expression was careful. "Nothing relevant to our agreement." "What did he say?" The pause lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. He asked about the Mercer woman's husband, whether the situation with the debt needed to be revisited given the change in circumstances. Damien looked at Marco. "And you said?" "I said no." Marco met his eyes. "I said she's not part of this." Damien looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he turned and went out through the side door into the cold Bridgeport air, and the river was visible at the end of the street, brown and flat, and carrying the last of the season's dead leaves south. He sat in the car for 60 seconds and did nothing. Then he called Donna. She picked up on the second ring and he said, "Is Hannah there?" And Donna said yes, and he said, "Put her on." A pause, a shuffle, then Hannah's voice, careful and awake. "I'm coming back," he said. A breath on the other end, then, "Okay." He drove north. The problem arrived not as a phone call or a gunshot, but as a name, spoken 40 minutes later by a federal agent named Carla Voss, who was standing in the doorway of the studio apartment on Ravenswood with a badge and a partner, and the specific expression of a woman who had been building something for a long time and was now watching it come together in a way that was both satisfying and complicated. He didn't know how they'd found the Ravenswood address. He thought about that for a long time afterward. The most likely answer was that he'd been followed from Bridgeport, which meant someone had been watching the meeting with Marco Castellano, which meant the federal interest in this situation was already active and already informed. "Mr. Valente," Voss said from the doorway, with her badge still extended. "I think you know why we're here." He was standing in the middle of the small room. Hannah was behind him. Donna was in the kitchen doorway. Eli had been asleep for the last hour, on the narrow couch with his feet hanging off the end. "I have some guesses," Damien said. Voss came in, and her partner, younger, male, with the alert tension of someone not yet habituated to the particular atmosphere of these kinds of rooms, came in behind her and they left the door open, which was a choice. "Last night's incident at Fennel," Voss said. She was looking at Damien, but she was aware of Hannah with the peripheral attention of someone trained to be aware of everything in a room simultaneously. "We've been looking at the Castellano-Valente corridor conflict for 14 months. Last night accelerated our timeline," she paused, "and created some additional complexities." "How can I help you?" Damien said, with the flat courtesy that was his version of a door half open. Voss looked at Hannah. "Ms. Mercer," she said, "I need to ask you some questions, separately." Damien felt Hannah shift behind him. He turned slightly. She was looking at Voss with the same assessing eyes she turned on everything, and she gave Damien a look that said, very briefly, very clearly, that she could manage this. And then she moved toward Voss and Voss's partner, and the three of them stepped out into the hallway, and the door was pulled most of the way closed. Damien stood in the studio apartment with Donna and the sleeping child and the open case files of his life arranged around him like walls. And he waited, and the waiting was a specific kind of terrible. When the door opened again, it wasn't Voss who came back in first. It was Hannah, and her face was different. Not shattered, not afraid. Different in a way he couldn't read, which was new because he had become, over the last 15 hours, able to read her face with a reliability that surprised him. She looked at him. "There's something you don't know," she said. "Tell me." She came fully into the room and the door swung behind her and Voss's partner remained in the hall, and Voss came in and stood near the door with her badge put away and her hands at her sides. "Derek," Hannah said. "My ex-husband." She stopped, started again, more carefully, the way you do when the information you're carrying is too fragile for speed. "He's been cooperating with federal investigators for the last 4 months. His debt, your organization's debt, was part of it. The collectors who came after him. He went to the FBI and agreed to provide information about Valente collection operations in exchange for debt relief and immunity. Damien went very still. "He's a federal informant," he said. "Yes." Hannah's eyes were on him, steady and unafraid and deeply, carefully watching. "And the information he provided," Damien said slowly. "About the collection operations? The collectors who work under Briggs's authority." Voss said from near the door, "Enough to build a case, Mr. Valente. A substantial one." The room rearranged itself. Not physically, just in his understanding of it, every wall shifting 3 degrees, every line of sight changing. He had walked into Fennel last night and sat down for a birthday dinner, and a woman had crossed a room and put her hand on his arm and pulled him out of a confrontation, and he had understood it as a simple act of human intervention, and it had been, he still believed that, still believed she hadn't known, but it had also been, without her knowledge, the beginning of something that now sat in this room like a third presence. Her ex-husband had sold information about operations that ran through Carl Briggs. Briggs, who had been running a conspiracy with the Castellano family. Briggs, who had used Hannah's existence, her routines, her plans, her son's birthday, as a mechanism. Which meant Derek Mercer's information had inadvertently exposed Briggs. Which meant the federal case that was building had Briggs at the center of it. Which meant the man who'd tried to have Damien killed was also the man most useful to the federal investigation. Which meant Voss needed Briggs alive and talking, and Damien needed Briggs contained and accountable, and those two needs were not the same need, and the woman standing in front of him was caught between them through no fault of her own except having married the wrong man 9 years ago. Miss Mercer had no knowledge of her ex-husband's cooperation, Voss said. She was not approached, not informed, not involved. We've confirmed that. I know, Damien said. He kept his eyes on Hannah. I know she wasn't. Hannah was looking at him with something in her expression that might have been the beginning of an apology, except she had nothing to apologize for, and he thought she knew that, but the weight of it was on her anyway, because that was how she was built. She carried the consequences of things she hadn't caused, because they lived in proximity to her. Briggs is in my custody, Damien said to Voss. We know, Voss said. That's the other thing we need to talk about. He stays in my custody until I understand the full scope of what he did. That's not, he stays in my custody, Damien said again, with the same inflection, no louder, no faster, until I'm satisfied. Then you can have whatever conversation with him you need to have. He paused. But I need tonight. Voss looked at him for a long moment. She was calculating something, and he let her calculate it, because the calculation would come out the same place regardless of how long she ran it. She needed Briggs. She needed Briggs coherent and cooperative, and with enough organizational knowledge to make the case she'd been building for 14 months worth the 14 months it had cost. She needed him in a condition to talk, which meant she needed Damien to not do the thing to Briggs that Damien would otherwise do to someone who had tried to have him killed and used a woman's child as a chess piece. Tonight, Voss said. Tonight, Damien confirmed. She held his eyes for 3 more seconds, then nodded. Damien turned back to Hannah. She was still watching him with that unreadable expression, and he realized what it was now. Not an apology, not exactly. It was the look of someone who was recalculating the cost of the last 24 hours and arriving at a number that was higher than they'd expected, and trying to decide whether the number was one they could live with. He took a breath. He opened his mouth to say something. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Reeves. He answered it, and before he could speak, Reeves said, in a voice stripped of everything except the information, Briggs is gone. Someone came for him. 2 of my people are down. A pause that was its own kind of horror. Damien, they left something. In the car where he was being held. Another pause. A photograph of the Ravenswood building, taken this morning. The photograph had a timestamp. The timestamp was 40 minutes ago, which meant whoever had just taken Carl Briggs had been watching Ravenswood while Damien was in Bridgeport shaking hands with Marco Castellano, and Marco Castellano had looked him in the eye across a cold storage room and talked about clean resolutions, and the photograph had already been taken, and the handshake had been a message dressed as an agreement, and somewhere in a city of 3 million people, Carl Briggs was in the hands of people who needed him silent before a federal case could be built around what he knew. And Damian Valente was standing in a room with a federal agent and a woman he had no framework for, and a sleeping 7-year-old, and the wreckage of every assumption he'd walked into the last 24 hours carrying, and for the first time in 9 years of running an organization built on the premise that he was always 3 moves ahead, he understood with absolute clarity that he was not ahead at all. He was exactly where someone had needed him to be. He had 45 seconds of absolute stillness. Not peace, not calm. The specific stillness of a man whose entire operational framework had just been inverted, and who was running the new geometry through every calculation simultaneously before he allowed himself to move. The studio apartment on Ravenswood held its breath around him. Donna hadn't moved. Voss was watching him with the contained intensity of someone who understood she was in the presence of a decision being made, and that her best option was to not interrupt it. Hannah was watching him too. She hadn't spoken since the call. She was reading the room the way she always read rooms. Fast, comprehensive, nothing wasted. Damian lowered the phone. "Briggs is gone," he said to Voss. Voss's expression didn't change, which meant she was better at this than most. "Gone how?" "Taken. 2 of my people are down." He looked at her directly. "Someone was watching Ravenswood this morning while I was in Bridgeport, which means the meeting with Castellano was either a setup or someone inside Castellano's operation is running a play Marco doesn't know about. Or Marco knew exactly what he was doing," Voss said. "Or that." He moved toward the door. "I need to go." "Mr. Valente." "I'll call you," he said. "You have my number now, apparently. If Briggs is taken, he's in danger. Whatever you think about what he did—" "I know what danger he's in," Damian said. "That's why I'm moving." He stopped at the door and looked back at Hannah. She was standing in the center of the small room, and she looked, for the first time since the restaurant, like someone who didn't know what to do with her hands. Not afraid, just suspended. Caught between the version of last night that had been about a birthday dinner and the version it had turned into. "Stay here," he said. "Donna, nobody leaves. Nobody opens the door." "Damian!" Hannah's voice stopped him. One word, his name, and the way she said it wasn't a plea. It was a statement, the kind people make when they want you to understand something without having to say it all the way out. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he went. Reeves was in a black SUV on Pershing when Damian called him, engine running, 2 men in the back who Damian had worked with long enough to trust at the specific level this situation required. Not completely, because complete trust was a thing he was reassessing in real time, but enough. Reeves's voice on the phone had the taut quality of a man managing controlled rage, and when Damian arrived and got in the front, the rage was visible in the set of his jaw and the way his hands sat on the wheel. "Tell me the rest," Damian said. Reeves told him. 4 men had come for Briggs at the location where Reeves had been holding him, a private garage in Bridgeport, 3 blocks from the river, which was now a fact that had a different quality to it than it had 40 minutes ago. Bridgeport. 3 blocks from the cold storage facility where Damian had shaken Marco Castellano's hand. The proximity was not accidental. Nothing today was accidental. "How did 4 men know where Briggs was being held?" Damian said. Reeves's jaw worked. "Only 3 people knew that location besides me and the 2 men who are currently in the hospital. You, Marcus, and Vincent Carr." Damian looked at the windshield. Marcus had called him 19 times last night and had not stopped calling. Marcus, who had been with him for 7 years and whose sister Damian had helped relocate when her husband became a problem 2 years ago. Marcus, who was currently sitting at the Valente townhouse on North Astor Street, doing what exactly? "Marcus didn't know," Damian said. Not because he was certain, because he needed to decide what he was certain about and then act on it, and certainty was a resource he had to allocate carefully right now. "That leaves Vincent," Reeves said. Damian thought about Vincent Carr arriving at the warehouse at 8:58, precise and composed and looking at Damian and saying thank God and sounding like he meant it. 1 call last night, 1 call to confirm or to listen or to calibrate. and then nothing. Silence while the night unraveled and other people made 11 calls and 4 calls, and Vincent Carr made 1. "Where is Vincent now?" Damien said. Reeves said nothing for a moment. Then, "I don't know." "Find him." Damien turned to the 2 men in the back seat. "I need the Castellano Operations Chicago infrastructure. Properties, contacts, anyone they use when they're in the city. Marcus has the file. Call him." "It's going to take 20 minutes, Damien said. "You have 20 minutes. Reeves pulled out of the lot and drove. The city moved around them, indifferent, fully operational, people going about their Saturday with the focused ordinariness of people who didn't know that the architecture of something significant was coming apart 2 blocks away. The call from Marcus came at 11:14. He had the file. He read from it, fast, and Damien listened with his eyes closed and his hands flat on his thighs and the cold November light coming through the SUV window, laying shadows across his face. 2 properties. One was a hotel suite at the Langham, visible, comfortable, the kind of place that said Marco Castellano was a legitimate businessman on a legitimate trip. The other was a commercial kitchen facility near the stockyards on the south side that the Castellano family held through a restaurant supply company that had been operating in Chicago for 9 years and had never attracted notable interest. Commercial kitchen, large space, loading access, discreet, the kind of place where you held someone you needed to talk to before you decided what to do with them. "The stockyards property," Damien said. "That's where he is." "We don't know," Reeves started. "That's where he is," Damien said again. "How long?" 15 minutes. Go." Reeves went. They came off the expressway and into the south side streets. The neighborhood changing texture around them. The wide, flat blocks near the old stockyards with their mix of warehousing and food distribution and the specific industrial residue of a city that had spent a century processing things on a massive scale. The restaurant supply company occupied a low building set back from the street with a chain-link perimeter and a roll-up loading door on the east side, and a small parking area with 3 vehicles in it, none of which had reason to be there on a Saturday morning if the building was what it claimed to be. Reeves parked 2 blocks out. He looked at Damien. 4 of us, he said. 4, Damien agreed. "We don't know how many are inside." "No." "We should wait for backup. I can have 6 more people here and—" "Briggs has been in there for at least 40 minutes, Damien said. "The people holding him are not waiting for us to get our numbers right." He opened the door. 4 is enough. It wasn't a statement of confidence. It was a statement of arithmetic. The building had 2 visible entry points. 4 men, 2 per entry, moving fast and with the specific controlled violence of people who knew what they were doing. It was enough. It had to be. They went in through the loading door on the east side, which Reeves's second man got open in 90 seconds, with a tool set that lived in the SUV's center console, and the smell of the place hit them immediately. Cold metal and cleaning chemicals, and underneath it something organic and recent that Damien didn't name but recognized. The interior was a large commercial prep space, stainless steel surfaces, and industrial refrigerators, and the skeletal overhead of a commercial HVAC system. The lights were on in the far section, beyond a partial wall of shelving units, and from that direction came voices, not many, 2 or 3, and another sound that Damien identified and then stopped identifying because the identification wasn't useful. He went left around the shelving. Reeves went right. The other 2 went through the center, low and fast. What was in the far section? 4 men, 3 of whom turned at the sound of entry and were engaged by Reeves and his 2 before any of them got to what they were reaching for. The 4th man was not reaching for anything. The 4th man was sitting in a chair with his wrists zip-tied to its arms and his face in a condition that explained the organic smell. Carl Briggs looked up through swollen eyes at Damien standing in front of him, and something in his expression did a thing that Damien hadn't expected. It didn't show relief. It showed something that was almost its opposite. The expression of a man who had been hoping, on some level, that rescue wouldn't come, because rescue meant accounting. The room was secured in under a minute. 3 men down, none of Damien's. Reeves zip-tied them with the economy of someone who had done this often enough that it had stopped feeling like anything. Damien crouched in front of Briggs. "Carl," he said. Briggs's breathing was labored. His left eye was swollen, mostly shut. There was dried blood along his jawline and something wrong with the angle of 2 fingers on his right hand. He'd been here 40 minutes, and they'd used the 40 minutes. They wanted the federal contact, Briggs said. His voice was wet. Who Derek Mercer was talking to. Did you give it to them? Briggs was quiet for a moment. That was its own kind of answer. Carl. Damien's voice was flat and very quiet and very close. Did you give them Voss? I didn't. Briggs stopped. His chest heaved once. They already knew her name. They just wanted confirmation. They wanted to know how much she had. He looked at Damien through the one working eye, and in the eye was something that might have been the beginning of understanding how far this had gone. I didn't know they were going to. What? Damien said. What didn't you know? They have someone, Briggs said, inside Voss's office. Not Voss. Someone below her. Someone who's been feeding case progress to the Castellano family for... He stopped again and coughed, and the cough was bad. Months, Damien. They've had someone inside the federal investigation for months. Damien looked at him. They know everything Voss has, Briggs said. They knew about Mercer before Voss did. They knew about the corridor case. They knew... He stopped. Something shifted in his face. They know about the woman, Hannah. They know she was with you. The temperature of the room changed, not physically, just in Damien's understanding of it. Why does that matter to them? He said carefully. Briggs looked at him with the one working eye, and in the eye was something that looked like the last residue of a man who had been, at some point, capable of conscience. Because she talked to Voss this morning. Because whatever she told Voss is now part of the federal record. And because the person inside Voss's office is going to have that record within the hour. Damien stood up. He was already moving when Reeves said his name, and he was at the loading door when his phone was in his hand, and he was calling the Ravenswood number. The landline, the one he'd shown Donna how to use, as he came out into the cold stockyards air, and it rang 4 times, and then 5, and then 6. No answer. He called Donna's cell. It rang twice and went to voicemail. He called Hannah's cell, which he'd made her give him the number for at 6 in the morning in the safe house kitchen. It rang once. She picked up. Where are you? He said. Still here. Her voice was strange. A specific kind of strange, controlled in the way a voice gets controlled when something is happening in the room that the voice doesn't want to reveal. Are you alone? He said. A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Hannah, he said. There's someone here, she said very carefully. A man. He has a badge. He says he's federal. Is Voss with him? No. What's his name? Another pause. Then, in the same careful voice, he says his name is Agent Carver. He says you called him. Damien had not called anyone named Carver. Put him on, Damien said. A shuffle, a new voice, male, early 40s, with the practiced neutral of a professional. Mr. Valente, I've been assigned to provide additional security for Ms. Mercer and the child. Agent Voss authorized. What's Voss's badge number? Damien said. A pause. I don't have that information on... Her badge number, Damien said again. She showed it to me this morning. I have it. Tell me hers. The pause this time was different. It had a quality of recalculation. Then the voice said, I think there's been a miscommunication. Give the phone back to Hannah, Damien said. A beat. Then Hannah's voice, and it was tighter now, the control straining at the edges. Here. Is Donna in the room? No. Where's Eli? He's next to me. Listen to me very carefully, Damien said. He was already at the SUV, already pointing at Reeves, who started the engine with the wordless efficiency of a man who had been reading Damien for 9 years and knew what the face meant. The man in that room is not a federal agent. Do not do anything he tells you to do. I need you to stay on this phone, and I need you to tell me where in the apartment you are. Kitchen, she said, and her voice had gone to the place voices go when the body understands something before the mind has confirmed it. A specific kind of quiet that was not calm, but was the thing that lives on the other side of fear when fear runs out of room. Is there a window in the kitchen? Yes. How far up? 2nd floor, maybe 12 feet. Can you see the street from it? Yes, there's a... She stopped. In the background, the male voice said something low and authoritative that Damien couldn't make out. Then Hannah's voice came back and it had changed register completely, gone from controlled to something harder and flatter. He wants me to hang up. Don't hang up. I'm not hanging up, she said, and it came out with a precision that told him she'd already made her own decision about this. Where's Eli right now? Exactly. Right here. I'm holding his hand. Good. Keep holding it. Reeves was already pushing the SUV onto the expressway northbound, the engine climbing, Chicago opening up ahead of them in the flat gray November light. I'm 12 minutes away. Can you stay on the line for 12 minutes? Yes, she said. Talk to me. Tell me what he's doing. He's near the door, she said. Her voice had gone to the quality of someone narrating a scene they're also inhabiting, the detachment of necessary observation. He's got his hand on something in his jacket. He's watching me. Is he between you and the front door? Yes. What about the bedroom? A pause. He could hear her assessing. Clear. Door's open. When I tell you, I want you to take Eli into that bedroom and put the chair from the desk under the door handle. Can you do that? Yes. Not yet. Wait for me to say. She said nothing. He could hear her breathing, steady and deliberate, the breath of someone who was scared and had decided that fear was information and not a command. Reeves had the SUV at 90 on the expressway. The city blurred past the windows. In the back seat, the two men were checking what they had with the quiet efficiency of preparation. He's moving, Hannah said. Toward you. Yes. Now, Damien said. Bedroom. Now. He heard the movement. Fast. A child's surprised sound that wasn't quite a cry. Footsteps. The slam of a door. Then her voice, breathless. In. Chairs under. From somewhere behind the door, the male voice, no longer neutral, saying something with an edge to it that needed no translation. You did good, Damien said. Stay low. Away from the door. He's going to come through it, she said. I know. Don't let Eli see whatever happens next. Put him against the far wall and put yourself between him and the door. A silence. Then, okay. How's the window? It opens. Old latch. Can you get onto the roof of the bay window below, or is it a straight drop? A pause. He heard the window, the groan of an old latch resisting. There's a ledge, maybe 8 inches. Wide enough? Maybe. The door sound changed. Something harder against it, not knocking, the specific pressure of someone testing a barrier's tolerance. Damien, she said. 4 minutes, he said. I need 4 minutes. The chair's not going to hold 4 minutes. He looked at the expressway ahead. He looked at the speedometer. He said, then make it 3. And Reeves, who had been listening to the whole thing, put his foot down, and the SUV leaped forward, and the city became a blur, and in the bedroom of a studio apartment on Ravenswood Avenue, a woman he had known for less than 24 hours was holding her son against a wall with her body while a door came apart behind her. And Damien Valente felt something move through him that was not like anything he had a name for, a thing that bypassed every layer of professional distance and cold calculation, and 9 years of learned isolation, and hit something underneath all of it that he'd thought had stopped being accessible a long time ago. The door sound changed again. A crack. The chair giving. He's through, Hannah said. Her voice had gone to a place that was beyond fear and beyond control and was something rawer than both of them. The SUV came off the exit at a speed that was not legal, and Reeves ran a light without slowing, and another, and the Ravenswood block appeared ahead. A sound came through the phone that wasn't Hannah's voice or Eli's voice or the agent's voice. It was a specific sound, the dense, brief sound of something physical, followed by a very short silence, followed by a crash. Then Hannah's voice again. Breathing hard. I'm okay. Damien said nothing. I hit him, she said. With the lamp. A pause. He's down. I don't know for how long. Reeves pulled the SUV to the curb. Damien was out before it fully stopped, taking the stairs 3 at a time, hitting the apartment door with his shoulder, coming through into a space that had been rearranged by violence. The chair splintered, the bedroom door hanging crooked on its upper hinge. The man called Carver on the floor of the bedroom with a lamp base beside him that had not survived the encounter in any meaningful sense. Hannah was against the far wall with Eli pressed behind her, and in her hands, empty now, the lamp gone, there was a trembling that she was visibly, determinedly refusing to let become anything larger than a tremor. She looked at Damien. He looked at her. Eli, from behind his mother, said in a very small voice, "That was the lamp." "Yeah," Damien said. "That was the lamp." He crouched beside the man on the floor and checked him with the practiced economy of someone who needed specific information fast. Breathing, pulse. The badge clipped to his belt, and he unclipped it and looked at it. And it was real, which was worse than if it had been fake, because real meant federal employee, and federal employee meant someone inside the apparatus that Briggs had just told him was compromised at a level Voss didn't know about. He looked up at Hannah. She was watching him, and the trembling had mostly stopped. And what was in her face now was the specific expression of a woman who had just done something she hadn't known she was capable of and was still processing what that meant. "Is he—" she started. "He's breathing," Damien said. "Good," she said, and then, after a pause, "I wasn't sure about the angle." He stood up. He looked at her for a moment that held more information than he had words for. Then he said, "We need to move, again." "I know," she said. She looked at her son. "Eli, put your shoes on, baby." "They're on," Eli said. She looked down. They were on. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else, and she bent down and pulled her son against her and held him for exactly 3 seconds, and Damien looked away. His phone rang. "Voss?" He answered it. "The man I sent to Ravenswood," she started, "is on the floor," Damien said. "He's alive. He's yours." A silence. "You need to tell me what you know," Voss said. "Right now, all of it." "I will," he said. "But first you need to know that someone in your office has been feeding case information to the Castellano family for months. Not a guess. Briggs confirmed it 40 minutes ago." The silence on Voss's end had a different quality than any of the previous silences in their conversation. It was the silence of a person watching something they built with great care develop a crack that ran all the way to the foundation. "How far up?" she said. Her voice was completely flat. "I don't know yet," Damien said, "but far enough that they knew about Mercer's cooperation before you moved on it. Far enough that they knew Hannah was with me before you did." He heard Voss's breathing, controlled, professional, the sound of someone who was furious and had decided that fury was a resource to be deployed later. "I need Briggs," she said. "I know you do. And I need the name of whoever is inside my office." "So do I," Damien said, "which is why we're going to find it together." He paused. "But not on the phone." He ended the call. He looked at Reeves, who was in the doorway of the bedroom with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had been running a security operation for 9 years and was now comprehensively reassessing the meaning of that phrase. "The warehouse on Pershing," Damien said. "We regroup there. Everyone I trust, and right now that is a list of 6 people, so count carefully." Reeves nodded. Damien turned to Hannah. She had Eli by the hand and her coat was on, and she was looking at him with those eyes that hadn't changed. Still assessing, still present, still doing the work of being inside this thing without disappearing into it. "You're still coming with me," he said. Not a question. "Where else would I go?" she said. He didn't have an answer for that. He put his hand briefly on Eli's head, an impulse, something that arrived before he could evaluate it. And the boy looked up at him and didn't pull away. And something in that small fact did something to Damien's chest that he put away for later, into a box with several other things from the last 18 hours that he didn't have the architecture to examine right now. They went down the stairs and into the street and into the SUV, and Reeves pulled out, and they were moving again, the city around them going about its Saturday. And in the warehouse on Pershing, the threads of the last 18 hours were waiting to be pulled into a shape that Damien could act on. He had Briggs. He had Voss. Damaged now, her operation compromised, but present and angry in a way that made her useful. He had a name to find. Whoever was inside Voss's office selling information to men who had put a gun in a restaurant full of people on a rainy November night. He had one other thing. He had a woman who had hit a federal agent with a lamp rather than open a door, who had held a phone steady through 3 minutes that would have broken most people he'd ever worked with, who had built something from nothing. In a neighborhood she'd complicated feelings about, and was raising a boy who knew when his shoes were on. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He was beginning to think the answer mattered more than he was ready to admit, and that the warehouse on Pershing was not where this story ended, but simply where the last piece of it was about to be put into place, and that whoever had decided to use Hannah Mercer and her son's birthday as an instrument in someone else's war was about to understand what it cost to make that decision. He had made up his mind somewhere between Bridgeport and Ravenswood, somewhere in the 12 minutes of driving with her voice in his ear, that the price would be paid in full. The warehouse on Pershing smelled the same as it always had. Cold concrete and machine oil and the faint chemical residue of a building that had processed things for decades before it became useful for a different kind of processing. Damien had been in this space more times than he could count, and it had never felt like anything except functional. A place where problems were brought and decisions were made, and then everyone went back to whatever the next problem was. It felt different now. He didn't examine why. Reeves had the perimeter covered with 4 men he'd personally vetted in the last hour, making calls while driving, asking questions that sounded casual and weren't, eliminating names from a list that had started at 12 and was now at 4. In the Valente organization's 9 years under Damien's leadership, there had never been a security reduction this severe. The organization was not going to look the same on the other side of today, and Damien had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere on the expressway coming north. Voss arrived at the warehouse at 1:15 in the afternoon. She came alone, which he hadn't expected and which told him something about where she was operating from right now. The compromised office problem had stripped her of the comfortable infrastructure of institutional authority, and she was working the same way he was working, on a reduced list, on instinct sharpened by the knowledge that the wrong call cost more than usual. She looked at Briggs first. Briggs was in a chair near the east wall, cleaned up as much as circumstances allowed, his 2 broken fingers taped by Donna, who had materialized at the warehouse with a first aid kit and the resigned competence of someone who had been cleaning up after the Valente organization's harder moments for 30 years. He looked like what he was, a man in the middle stages of understanding the full cost of what he'd decided to do. Voss looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at Damien. "The name inside my office," she said. "We'll get there," he said. "Sit down." She sat. It was a measure of where things stood that she did it without argument. Damien stood at the center of the warehouse floor, and he went through it, all of it, the reservation, the shell entity. Lakeward Consulting in New York 14 months ago, and Vincent Carr at that dinner. Derek Mercer's debt and the mechanism of Hannah's placement in the restaurant. Briggs's 16-year arc from loyalty to a conspiracy he'd built slowly enough that it had looked from the inside like pragmatism rather than betrayal. Marco Castellano and the cold storage facility and the handshake that had been a performance. Briggs's 40 minutes in the commercial kitchen near the stockyards and what he'd given them under pressure and what he'd withheld. He laid it out without editorial. Just the sequence, just the facts, the way you lay out evidence when you need other people to see the shape of something you've been inside for 18 hours. When he finished, the warehouse was quiet. Voss said, "Agent Carver." "Your man on the floor in Ravenswood," Damien said. "He's been in the organized crime division for 6 years. I've worked with him for 4 of those." She was looking at the middle distance, the specific look of someone revising a large amount of prior information simultaneously. He would have had access to every piece of the Mercer cooperation, the corridor case, witness locations. She paused. Everything. "Did he place the lamp, or did Hannah?" Reeves said from the wall. Nobody answered that immediately. "Carver is going to need medical attention," Voss said. "And then he is going to need a very specific kind of conversation." She looked at Damien. "With people from outside my office." "Agreed," Damien said. Voss looked at Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, I need you to tell me every contact you had with the Castellano family, every communication, every intermediary, every location. I need dates, and I need names, And I need you to understand that the degree to which you cooperate right now is the degree to which I can do anything useful for you in the proceedings that follow." Briggs looked at her. He looked at Damien. His working eye had the quality of a man who had run every calculation available to him and arrived at the single remaining option. "I want immunity," he said. "You're not getting immunity," Voss said. "Reduced? Tell me what you have, and I'll tell you what's possible," Voss said. "That's the only offer on the table, and it has a shelf life of about 4 minutes. So," Briggs looked at his taped fingers. He looked at the floor. He said, "The contact inside your office wasn't just Carver." The room went still. "Carver was the operational feed," Briggs said. "He moved information, but the relationship was established by someone above him, someone who has been running an informal arrangement with Castellano interests for—" He stopped, swallowed. "Closer to 3 years." Voss's expression did not change. This was an act of considerable professional discipline, because what Briggs was describing meant that the compromise in her office was not a rogue junior agent, but something that had been living inside the institution for 3 years and had been invisible to her for 3 years, and had been using everything she built as a resource for people she was investigating. "Name," she said. "1 word." Briggs gave it. Damien didn't know the name. Voss did. He watched her face when she heard it. Watched the particular way a person's face looks when something they trusted completely reveals itself to have been something else entirely. And he recognized the expression because he had worn it himself at various points in the last 18 hours. And he understood that recognition was the most honest thing he could offer her right now, so he said nothing. After a moment, Voss said, "How long have you known?" 3 months, Briggs said. "And you used it," Damien said. "Not accusation, just the fact of it." "I used it," Briggs said. He had the decency not to qualify that. Voss stood up. She made 2 calls in quick succession, stepping away from the group, her voice low and precise. The calls were short. When she came back, her expression had reconstituted itself into something professional and forward-looking, the face of a person who had decided that the appropriate response to a 3-year institutional betrayal was to dismantle it with complete thoroughness and file the anger for a time when the work was done. "I need Briggs in federal custody," she said to Damien. "Take him," Damien said. Briggs looked at Damien when he said it. In the look was something that wasn't quite a request for something. Not forgiveness, because Briggs was not a man who would insult them both by asking for that, but something adjacent to acknowledgement. The need to be seen as something more than the worst thing he'd done. Damien looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was both true and useful, and he had decided some years ago that those were the only words worth spending. Reeves took Briggs out to Voss's vehicle, and the door closed, and the warehouse contracted back into itself. Damien stood in the space that Briggs had occupied and felt the specific weight of 16 years lift off him, not cleanly, nothing this complicated lifted cleanly, but lift nonetheless, replaced by something heavier and more honest, the weight of what came next. He was thinking about Marco Castellano. The handshake in the cold storage facility had been a performance, yes. The meeting had been designed to position Damien away from Ravenswood while Briggs was taken and Carver was sent to clean up the remaining complications. All of that was true. And Marco Castellano had known it when he looked Damien in the eye and talked about clean resolutions. That required a response. The response was not going to be the one that the version of Damien who had walked into this warehouse 9 years ago would have designed. He sat with that for a moment, examined it, decided it was true. He called a number he had not called in 2 years. It rang 3 times. A man picked up, older, careful, with the voice of someone who had learned long ago that the phone was a place where only the most necessary words belonged. "Anthony," Damien said. Anthony Castellano, 81 years old, who had run a Detroit organization for 4 decades and had 3 years ago handed the operational reins to his eldest son with what had been described publicly as graceful retirement, and was in practice a gradual transfer that had not been as complete as Marco preferred to believe. "Damien Valente," the old man said. "I heard there was trouble." "There was," Damien said. "Some of it came from your family's direction." A pause, the kind that acknowledged something without confirming it. I'd like to have a conversation about the corridor, Damien said. A real one, not the kind your son proposed yesterday. Marco made decisions this week that I'm going to need to account for, Damien said. I'm not calling to threaten your family. I'm calling because the alternative to a conversation is a war, and you and I are both old enough to know what wars cost. He paused. I'd rather spend the next 3 years building something than burning something down. Another pause. Longer. Come to Detroit, Anthony Castellano said. Next week. We'll have dinner. Just dinner, Damien said. Just dinner, the old man confirmed. He ended the call. He looked at the phone in his hand for a moment, at the screen going dark, and then he put it in his pocket and turned. Hannah was standing near the side door of the warehouse. She had Eli by the hand, and Eli had found something on the floor, a bolt or a washer, some small piece of hardware, and was examining it with the focused scientific interest of a 7-year-old who had spent the last 18 hours in a series of unfamiliar rooms and had arrived at a place of peaceful curiosity about the physical world as a counterweight to the rest of it. Damien walked to her. She looked at him. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened, and her hair had fully escaped whatever had remained of the ponytail, and she was still in the clothes from the restaurant, now more than 20 hours ago, and she looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had been through something that had no name yet and was still on her feet. It's over, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Is it? The immediate part. Yes. She nodded slowly. Derek, she said. His cooperation agreement stands. Voss is going to honor it. His debt is cleared. I'm handling that directly. He paused. He's not going to be a problem for you. Something moved across her face that was complicated enough that he didn't try to read it. 11 years of history with a person, whatever those 11 years had contained, did not resolve into a simple expression when you learned that the person had inadvertently put you and your child in the path of gunfire. He didn't try to simplify it for her. He didn't know, she said, about last night, about what Briggs would do with it. No, Damien said. He didn't know. She looked at her son, who had moved on from the bolt and was now dragging the toe of his shoe in a slow arc across the concrete floor, watching the market left. He's still the person who needed Eli's birthday dinner to get him out of his problems, she said quietly. The federal thing, that's separate from the kind of person he is. Yeah, Damien said. She looked back at Damien. You called someone just now, I heard part of it. Detroit, he said. Is that going to fix it? It's going to start fixing it, he said, which is different and slower and doesn't make for a clean ending. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more worn in than a smile. No, she said, it doesn't. They stood for a moment in the cold warehouse with the sound of the city outside and Eli's shoe making its arcs on the floor and the weight of the last 20 hours settling around them like sediment after water stills. I want to go home, she said. Not complaint, just information. The clear, direct statement of a person who knew what they needed. I'll take you, he said. He drove them himself. No Reeves, no backup, no security apparatus, just the sedan. The same stolen Volvo, technically, which he'd return or replace, and which was currently the most unassuming vehicle he had access to, moving through Chicago on a Saturday afternoon with the city doing what cities do, which was continue regardless. Eli fell asleep in the back seat within 4 minutes, which was a mercy, and Hannah sat in the front and watched the city go past the window and said nothing for a long time, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had been earned rather than constructed. They were passing through Bridgeport, the river visible on the right, when she said, "What happens to your organization?" "It changes," he said. "How?" He thought about how to say what was true. "There are things I built that I'm going to take apart. The collection operation that ran through Briggs. I'm shutting that down. The corridor arrangement with Detroit, if we reach one, is going to be above board enough that it doesn't require what last night required." She looked at him. "Above board?" "More above board," he said. "I'm not going to insult you with the word legitimate." She turned back to the window. "No," she said. "Don't." He drove. The property in Andersonville, he said. The safe house. It's clean. The address compromise was through Carver, and Carver is done. You could... He stopped, started again. If you needed somewhere, if the bakery needs time before it's safe for you to be there with Eli. Are we in danger? She said. Direct, the way she'd asked everything. He thought about it honestly. Less than we were 20 hours ago. The active threat is neutralized. Briggs is in custody. Carver is done. The Castellano situation is moving toward a different kind of resolution. He paused. But I'm not going to tell you there's no residue, because there is, and you deserve an honest answer. She was quiet for a moment. How long? Weeks, maybe a month, until the federal case moves and the key figures are locked in and the Castellano family understands that the Chicago situation is resolved. She looked at her hands in her lap. I have a bakery, she said. I have staff. I have orders I'm already behind on. I know. I can't just disappear for a month. I know, he said again. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to let me make sure you're not exposed while things settle. He paused. After that, I step back. You go back to your life. Eli goes back to school. The bakery runs. She was looking at him now, and in her expression was something that was doing work. The careful, exhausted work of a person who is trying to see a situation clearly when being close to it makes clarity expensive. And you, she said. And I deal with what I have to deal with. Alone, she said. He didn't answer that. She looked at the road ahead. You sat at my son's birthday dinner, she said, and you listened to me talk about my bakery and my neighborhood, and you ate your steak, and you were, for 40 minutes, you were a person sitting at a table. She paused. And then the shooting started, and you went somewhere else. You went somewhere I couldn't follow. Yes, he said, but you came back. He looked at the road. You kept coming back, she said, last night, this morning, Ravenswood. Her voice was quiet and specific, the way it always was when she was saying something she'd worked out fully before speaking. That's not nothing. No, he said, it's not. They pulled onto her street in Pilsen 20 minutes later, the bakery visible from the corner, dark inside with the closed sign on the door, the hand-painted sign above the window, reading Mercer's in letters she'd done herself, based on a style she'd spent 3 weeks practicing. He could see that from the car, the evidence of the 3 weeks. He parked in front of it. Eli woke up when the engine stopped, the immediate animal alertness of a child whose body knows when motion ends, and he looked out the window and said, We're at the bakery. Yeah, Hannah said. Can I have a cookie? It's closed, Bug. You have the key. She looked at her son for a moment, and then she laughed. It was a short laugh, tired and genuine and without performance, the laugh of someone who had been through something real and had arrived on the other side to find a 7-year-old asking about cookies. And that was what life was. And it was both absurd and exactly right. She got out of the car. Eli scrambled out after her. She went to the bakery door and unlocked it, and they went inside. And through the window, Damien could see the dark interior come to life as she found the light switch. The glass cases, the counter, the kitchen door at the back, the small round tables with their mismatched chairs that she'd clearly sourced from different places over time, nothing matching, everything chosen. He sat in the car. After a minute, she came back out. She stood at the passenger window and looked at him. Come in, she said. He looked at her. Have a cookie, she said. You haven't eaten since... I don't even know when you last ate. He got out of the car. The bakery smelled like flour and brown sugar and something with cardamom that he couldn't identify. Eli was already behind the counter with the ease of a child who had been in this space since before it was finished, rooting around in a case for something specific. His paper crown long gone, but his manner unchanged. The absolute unself-consciousness of a kid in a place that was his. Hannah went behind the counter and found what she was looking for and put 2 things on a plate and brought it to one of the mismatched tables and sat down and looked at him until he sat across from her. On the plate were 2 cookies, large, irregular, the kind that had been made by someone who cared about how they tasted and not about how symmetrical they were. He picked one up. He ate it. It was genuinely good, the kind of good that was not about technique but about something more fundamental, about a person who understood what they were trying to make and had made it. He didn't say anything because the thing he wanted to say was not the kind of thing you said 20 hours after meeting someone in a restaurant ambush. But it was true, and he knew it was true, and that was enough for right now. Eli appeared from behind the counter with a cookie of his own and climbed onto the chair beside his mother with the complete physical confidence of a child who had never once considered that a chair might not hold him. "Are you going to come here again?" Eli asked Damien. Direct. No preamble. The conversational method of someone who had not yet learned to approach the things he wanted to know from an angle. Damien looked at Hannah. She was looking at her cookie, and the corner of her mouth had that movement again, the one that was more worn in than a smile. "If your mom says it's okay," Damien said. Eli looked at his mother. "Mom." "We'll see," she said, which was not no. Eli considered this with the judicial gravity of a 7-year-old evaluating a legal outcome. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and took a large bite of his cookie. They sat in the bakery for a while. The afternoon light came through the front window at the low angle of a November Saturday, the kind of light that made everything look like it was already remembering itself, already becoming the version that would be recalled later. Damien Valente sat at a mismatched table in a bakery in Pilsen and finished his cookie and did not think about the call to Detroit or Voss's investigation or the thread-by-thread reconstruction of an organization that was going to look different in 6 months than it looked yesterday. And he was aware that he was choosing not to think about those things. And he was aware that the choosing was itself something new. The drive back to the north side took 40 minutes in Saturday traffic. He sat in it without the restlessness that usually inhabited him in stillness, the constant forward lean of a man for whom the next thing was always more present than the current one. He sat in the traffic and watched the city and thought about a woman who had crossed a room 20 hours ago and put her hand on his arm and told a lie with complete conviction to a man she'd never met, and had done it because a stranger was about to make a bad decision and she didn't think that was acceptable. He thought about what that said about a person. In the months that followed, the changes came in the order they were supposed to come. Voss's investigation moved fast once the internal compromise was excised. Carver cooperated in exchange for the only deal available to him, which was not a good deal. And the name Briggs had given in the warehouse resolved into a federal case that ran parallel to the organized crime proceedings and consumed 3 months and resulted in outcomes that were reported in the Tribune with the careful language newspapers used when institutional failures were too large for direct statement. Carl Briggs pleaded to 3 counts. He was sentenced in February. Damien was not in the courtroom. He had said what he needed to say in a warehouse on a Saturday afternoon, and the legal proceedings that followed were Voss's domain, and he respected the boundary. Marco Castellano was the thing that took the longest and required the most from Damien's particular combination of patience and pressure. The dinner in Detroit with Anthony Castellano happened as arranged, in a private room, with food that was not as good as Fennel's, and conversation that was more honest than anything Marco had offered in the cold storage building. The old man understood things his son had not yet learned, chief among them that the most durable arrangements were the ones where both parties had something to lose. The corridor framework took 11 weeks to negotiate and was documented in language that would not survive scrutiny from certain federal angles, and for that reason would never be scrutinized from those angles, because Voss had a case, and Damien had made certain the case was fed what it needed, and the corridor was not what it needed. It was not clean. He had not promised Hannah clean. He had promised her more above board, which was a different and smaller thing, and he held to it. The collection operation that had run through Briggs's sector was dismantled in the first 3 weeks. The people who had used Derek Mercer's debt as a handle were reassigned or released, and Derek Mercer's paper was shredded in front of a witness, and Damien made certain Hannah knew it had been done because she deserved to know. He saw her 4 times in November. The first time was practical. A conversation about security protocols and timeline, Donna present, Eli at school, the conversation lasting 40 minutes and staying in its lane. The second time was less practical. He stopped at the bakery on a Wednesday afternoon on a route that had not previously taken him through Pilsen and did not have a reason to, and she was behind the counter, and she looked at him when he came in and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Cardamom shortbread today." And he sat at the mismatched table and had 2 and stayed for an hour. The third time, Eli was there, and Eli had opinions about a documentary he'd seen about prehistoric ocean creatures and presented those opinions to Damien with the comprehensive confidence of someone who understood that the audience's prior knowledge of the subject was irrelevant. Damien listened to the full account. He asked 2 questions. Eli answered them with the seriousness they deserved. He drove home that evening and sat in the North Astor townhouse, in a room that had always felt functional and felt, for the first time, like the wrong size. The 4th time was the one that mattered. It was late November, the city already cold in the particular committed way that meant winter was not a threat, but a fact. She was closing the bakery, turning the sign, and he was outside on the sidewalk because he had arrived and not yet gone in, and she saw him through the glass and came to the door and opened it. She looked at him for a moment. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me," he said. That night, the restaurant. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed and the November air moving between them. "You were alone on your birthday." "Yes." "You'd been alone on your birthday for a while, I'd guess." He looked at her. "Most of them," he said. She looked back at him with those steady, dark eyes, and in them was the thing he'd been watching accumulate since the restaurant. The thing that was not pity and not calculation, and was not the response to his name or his organization or the weight of what he was, but was instead a response to the specific person who had sat at her son's birthday table and listened and meant it. "You don't have to be," she said. He stood on the sidewalk outside a bakery in Pilsen in November and felt the weight of 40 years rearrange itself, not disappear. It didn't disappear. It wouldn't. That was not how weight worked. But shift, redistribute, land differently. "I know," he said. She stepped back from the door, opening it wider, and the warmth and the smell of the bakery came out into the cold street. He went in. 6 months after a rainy birthday dinner that had ended in gunfire and a stolen car and a paper crown that had finally come apart at the seams, Mercer's Bakery on a Friday morning had a line out the door that Hannah had not anticipated and was managing with the specific controlled energy of a person who had learned that the difference between a crisis and an opportunity was often just the direction you were already facing. She had hired 2 people. One was a pastry cook who'd trained in a serious kitchen and wanted fewer hours and more creative latitude. The other was Donna, who had suggested the arrangement herself with the matter-of-fact practicality of a woman who had spent 30 years managing difficult situations and found that flour and butter were considerably less stressful. Eli started 3rd grade in September and had a teacher he liked and a best friend named Marcus, which made Hannah smile every time she said the name aloud in front of Damien and made Damien make an expression that Eli had recently described as the face he makes when something is funny, but he doesn't want to say so. Eli had a name for the expression because he'd had occasion to observe it enough times to categorize it. That was the fact that mattered most, not the corridor agreement, not the federal case, not the reorganization of an organization that now had fewer moving parts and cleaner lines, and operated in a narrower lane than it had for the last decade. Those things were true, and would continue to be true, and required ongoing maintenance and vigilance, and the particular discipline of a man who had chosen a different kind of complexity. But the fact that mattered was that a 7-year-old boy had observed Damien's face often enough to name its expressions. On the morning that would have been his 41st birthday, which arrived in November, which arrived in the same city, which arrived in a world that looked different from the one the previous November had delivered, Damien sat at the counter of Mercer's Bakery before it opened, on a stool that was slightly too low for the counter, with a coffee that Hannah had made without asking how he took it because she'd been paying attention. And Eli was at the small corner table doing homework with the focused grievance of a child who has been told that weekends are not homework-free zones. Hannah was behind the counter doing something with a pastry brush that required more attention than it appeared to, and the bakery was warm, and outside the window the November street was doing what November streets do, which is exist in that particular quality of morning light that makes everything look both colder and more present than it usually does. She looked up at some point and found him watching her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the pastry brush. After a while she said, without looking up, "Happy birthday." He looked at the counter. He looked at the coffee. He looked at Eli, who had abandoned the homework and was now drawing something in the corner of his notebook with the absolute commitment of a child who has decided that the drawing is more important. "Yeah," Damien said. "It is." Outside, Chicago moved through its morning. The lake was somewhere to the east, cold and enormous, Carrying the season south. Somewhere in the federal courthouse on Dearborn, a case was being assembled with the patient architecture of institutional justice. Somewhere in Detroit, an old man was keeping an agreement because agreements kept were worth more than the alternatives, which he had learned over 81 years at considerable cost. Here, in a bakery in Pilsen, a man who had built an empire on fear and silence sat at a counter that was slightly too low and drank coffee made by someone who had been paying attention and understood, with the clarity that only arrives after the worst of something has passed and the sediment has settled, and what remains is what was actually true all along, that the thing he had driven past twice on cold November evenings and slowed down without meaning to was not the restaurant. It was this. Exactly this. The warmth inside something whole and unbroken. He had just needed to be thrown out of the right place, at the right moment, by the wrong man, and for a woman across a dining room to make a decision in under 3 seconds that changed the entire geometry of what came next. Nobody planned it. Nobody could have. That was the only part of the whole complicated story that was clean.